Good evening, everyone, and the warmest of welcome to you all. My name's Professor Gemma Stacey. I am Director of Academy at the Florence Nightingale Foundation, and I'm absolutely honoured and privileged to be with you this evening to host our FNF policy webinar focused on clinical supervision for students. Now, first job is to get some introductions in line. So let me introduce you to my wonderful panel that's joining me today. So first of all, we have Jess Sainsbury from Florence Nightingale Foundation, who is our Research and Policy Associate. We have Grace Cook from the Foundation of Nursing Studies. Thanks for the wave, Grace. And Grace is the Programme Lead for Resilience-Based Clinical Supervision. Louisa Long, who is Assistant Professor at the University of Nottingham, and again has led on a programme of work to embed clinical supervision into the pre-reg curriculum. And Professor Paula Holt, who is our Senior Nurse Advisor from the Nursing and Midwifery Council. And we also have Lincoln here, Gombedza, who I can't see now, there you are, Lincoln, giving us a wave, who's a student nurse at Keele University and will be presenting with Grace on the Resilience-Based Clinical Supervision project. So today's webinar is intended to be informative and interactive. We really want you to leave the session today really having a strong and robust argument for why clinical supervision is so central to student nurses during their pre-registration nurse education, and also a bit more about the how do we go about not only implementing clinical supervision but embedding and sustaining it within the curriculum. So our panelists will speak to you for about 10 minutes each on their position on this particular topic, and then we will open up to questions. So we'd love it if you would use the chat box to comment and to discuss throughout the presentations, and then the Q&A function if you have questions for our panelists at the end of their presentations. And I'll put those questions to the panelists once we've heard from them. So thank you all for putting your welcomes into the chat box. Carry on doing that so we know who's here and in the audience. And if there's anything particularly you want us to pay attention to, let us know and we'll make sure that the panel have time to address that. So my first panelist to present today is Jess Sainsbury, who is going to talk to you about the FNF journey that has brought us to this position today and to be able to speak to you about this particular focus around clinical supervision. So over to you, Jess.
Thanks, Gemma, and hi, everyone. If we could go to the next slide, please, Adam. Thank you very much, Adam. So it's so nice to be here, everyone. My name's Jess. As Gemma said, I'm a registered adult and mental health nurse, and I am working as a research and policy associate at the foundation. And one of the roles that I undertake is I chair our clinical supervision subject expert group, or SEG, which I'll probably say going forward because it's a bit of a mouthful. And I'd like to just tell you a bit of a story, I guess, about where on earth it's come from, what we've achieved so far, and what we're hoping to do going forward. So the FNF SEG, it started actually as a result of a tweet from an adult nurse who had been deployed in the first wave of the pandemic. They were struggling, they didn't know who to turn to, they felt guilty for wanting to talk through their experiences with others because they knew how overwhelmed and the situation that it was during that first wave. At the time, I was still a student nurse myself. I was chair of the Royal College of Nursing Students Committee, and we were running a series of webinars. And one of them, you guessed it, was to do with clinical supervision. The majority of the group that were panelists on that webinar actually stuck together to form the FNF Clinical Supervision SEG, because it perfectly aligned with the policy priority set by the FNF membership. So it's like all of these stars were aligning at the same time, which was brilliant. So since then, because that was in 2020, the SEG meets virtually on a bi-monthly basis, and we have representation from 4 nations. as well as the breadth of nursing experience, you know, from students to professors. We're open to all, which is great. And constantly kind of reviewing that membership to make sure we're as inclusive as possible too. So since that first webinar in 2020, highlights, I guess, of the achievements of the SEG, I'm going to reel off some for you, but even if I don't include everything, there are more, and we are sharing them on our social media channels and on our webpage, which is being developed as well. So a big one is we've attended the NMC's professional strategic advisory group a couple of times now, but the big one was in April 2021, where ourselves and our friends from FONS as well came and spoke about clinical supervision, and I'm sure we will fill you in more on that shortly. What we have also done is we have informed Twitter chats, the questions that were asked on there, which then resulted in a lot of data and information coming back to us to make sure that we were informed by what is actually going on for people on the ground as well. We've presented on many webinars for the Healthcare Leadership Academy, for Nursing Now, and Sigma Nursing as well. We, as I've said, FNF is a membership organisation, so we have consulted with our members at our World Cafe event, and we continue to do that as well to gain a picture of best practice. We really want to shine a light on where things are going well, and we can share learning from each other too, so that people don't have to reinvent the wheel when it comes to clinical supervision and how that's implemented in practice. And that's what today is about as well. A big one is we've published a series of articles in the Nursing Times. Again, we will drop the links to those in the chat here if you haven't read them already. And there are more coming, including a 4Nation piece. Something that's applicable to students and early career nurses, which is why you're all here today, is that we are collaborating with Nursing Now to trial a kind of matching of clinical supervisors and supervisees via an online platform called Vigo. We've also collaborated with Unison and the Nursing Times on a preceptorship campaign, of which the survey included questions regarding the perception of the access to clinical supervision for newly registered nurses, which is obviously just as relevant to our student attendees today, because it doesn't stop once you join the workforce. And the most recent one, which I would really recommend if you haven't already given it a listen, is two of our SEG members, Tony Butterworth and Joanne Bosanquet, have featured on a clinical supervision episode of a podcast. So we'll pop the link for that in the chat for you too. So, and there, as I've said, there were many more achievements, but I think those are probably the key ones. We are moving into the next phase of activity as a SEG, which is great. As I said, we've got 4Nation representation, but we do wish to grow that as well. And looking forward how we can influence policy, grow the evidence base, and help as much as we can. We're not championing a particular model of clinical supervision. We are more about sharing the benefits of it and how important it is for our workforce as a safety critical intervention, essentially. So going forward, we've got a chapter in a book that will be coming out and informing that. We've also have our summer FNF members event to inform the future direction of the SEG. We're looking forward to collaborating with the Nursing Now Challenges Committee on a global clinical supervision project. And this is a nice smooth link here, I hope. Our SEG members are we are working to author an NMC case study demonstrating how clinical supervision can be utilised as clinical practice hours for nursing students. And as I'm sure many of you are aware, that the NMC have recently written to all approved education institutions, which I'm sure Paula will talk about in more detail. So I'm not going to steal your thunder, Paula. And that's why we're here tonight. So I'm going to stop and hand over to our fantastic panel members to tell you a bit more in detail about how clinical supervision for students can be implemented and the benefits of it as well. So don't just listen to us, but actually hear from a current student nurse as well. Thanks, Gemma.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Jess. It just shows you so much work is happening in this space, really, to draw attention to how important an issue it is. And it's something that the pandemic has enabled us to shine a light on that importance. But this has been something that the profession have been asking for and advocating for many, many years. So we're going to take advantage of that fact that the momentum's there now and keep that moving with the commitment and support of you all in the audience today. We now have 139 people here, and I can see from the chat that represents students from all fields of practice, practice educators, clinical educators, academics, all different areas of practice and education that are supporting this agenda. So thank you so much for offering us your time and engaging in this learning together tonight. So our next panel member, I'd love to introduce you to, in fact, it's two. We're getting a double act here from Grace Cook and Lincoln from the Foundation of Nursing Studies and Keele University to share more about the realities of how we achieve the implementation of clinical supervision, but especially from Lincoln's perspective, why this is such a crucial and important offer for our student nurse and on our future workforce. Thanks, Grace.
Thanks, Gemma, and hi everyone. My name is Grace, and as Gemma said, I work for the Foundation of Nursing Studies, or FNF, as the lead facilitator for resilience-based clinical supervision. Or, you know, as we're healthcare workers and we love an acronym, RBCS. FNF is a really small charity. We're a small organisation that works with nurses and nurse-led teams, recognising that obviously nurses don't work in isolation, around workplace culture. And we very much use practice development principles, and we have a number of programmes, with RBCS being one of them. And I lead on that programme. And Lincoln, I'll just let you introduce yourself before I start talking a bit more.
Yeah, so I'm Lincoln Gombeza. I'm a third year student learning disability nurse from Keele University. And I'm looking forward to qualifying. You know, I'm finishing in 2 weeks' time. So yeah, I'll be talking to you more about my experience with the FNF team and resilience clinical supervision.
Thanks, Lincoln. And so I'm absolutely delighted to be here to talk about my favourite subject. So I'll try not to talk too much because I know we've only got till 6. But to start with, so resilience-based clinical supervision is a framework or a model of supervision. And it was initially developed focusing on students and that transition period into being a qualified nurse. It's very much a restorative model of clinical supervision. So anyone that's had any experience with any PNAs or have done the PNA programme might be familiar with this type of clinical supervision. And it's a framework, as I said, which focuses on our emotions and our feelings in response to a situation. So it involves co-creating a safe space, it involves doing grounding exercises, checking in and reflecting, and it always ends on a positive ending as well. The evidence base behind this shows that when it's kind of valued and when there's protected time and facilitator support to do this, this can aid with compassionate flow throughout an organisation. So that could be a university, it could be a small organisation, it could be a big organisation. So people feel valued, they feel a sense of belonging and containment, and they have this real courage to take action as well. And so that is what resilience-based clinical supervision is in a nutshell. I will put a link in the chat if anyone wants to read more, because there's a really good animation. It's about 5 minutes long if people want to see the process of it. We at FNF have been facilitating RBCS since 2020, and we were really, I suppose, delighted last year to be supported by Health Education England to offer it to student nurses and to do a small cohort for mental health and learning disability nurses. And we did a masterclass followed by 4 sessions of RBCS. And that sounds really, really short, but actually the experience was amazing for me as a facilitator, and I'm sure Lincoln's going to share his, well, I know he's going to share his experience as well. it was just amazing to be able to be with this group of student nurses that had never met each other. And at the end of that, we did a participatory evaluation. So the students that became involved, they evaluated the project themselves, and they created these word clouds, which I'll share with you now, which I think kind of says it all. You know, people found that they were increasing in confidence. I think the real big, I suppose, word that's on this that comes out is connection. And there really was a sense of belonging, and people were able to share in this safe, non-judgmental space, which they found like invaluable. And one of the things we found as well was that none of them had really experienced clinical supervision before. So this was really, really quite new. And everyone said at the end how important it is to become available in practice, and also for the students at university. And one of the things that we did as part of the programme is we mapped out the proficiencies for students onto clinical supervision and had that as part of the certificate. And there was a real mix about whether this could be classed as kind of placement hours or not. Eventually, everyone's did get classed as placement hours, but it did take a lot of conversations. And I think it was very clear that actually the experience that people have when they're in clinical supervision does help people meet their proficiencies. You know, it's part of our everyday practice to be reflective practitioners and to support each other and to provide value to each other. And so that was a really important aspect. And Jess mentioned before that we went to the NMC's PSAG group, and some of the students that experienced this with us came as well and were able to share their story. And I think I'll say a big thank, I don't know if anyone else is there, I know Lincoln is, but a big thank you to everyone that came to that and everyone that was part of the programme, because actually the stories are the powerful thing, and hearing people's experiences, it's the why, as Gemma said. And so I'm going to smoothly pass over to Lincoln now to tell us the story and what your experience was. Thanks, Lincoln.
Yeah, thanks Grace. Thanks Jess, thank you, and Professor Gemma Stacey. I want to thank also Joanne Bosencare, who was part of when this was introduced to me. So for me, I think our placements were suspended in our second year, and automatically, we're hearing from university, NMC have made this decision, and all these things. So for students, we're feeling quite emotional and raw about it, because we're really looking forward to our second year. Then I saw an email from Keele Uni saying, are there students who are interested in doing resilience clinical supervision? So I started reading about it. It's talking about your emotions, self-awareness, my confidence. Because at that time I was really thinking about, you're at home, we're doing quite a lot of workbooks, we're stuck at home, and my mental health is kind of like going deep and down, I'm hearing about mindfulness, just being aware of yourself. So I signed up for the resilience clinical based supervision course, and it really transformed my life as a student, because when I started going back on placement, I was really aware of who I was, because sometimes it's very easy to blame the managers, to blame anybody really. I'm not saying there are not issues, but who are you? What role are you playing in this situation that is unfolding in front of you? So that's what resilience clinical supervision taught me. It taught me to be really aware of myself, and also to practice gratitude. Sometimes after placements is finished, send the manager a thank you. Thank you for today. Thank you for showing me this. Show me how to do my placement. So when I changed my attitudes towards how I'm viewing situations, things just started changing. I started seeing a lot of positivity around my own mental health, mindfulness. And I one of the things I learned, I think from Grace itself, was look in your phone. How many people can you thank, in terms of gratitude? How many people can you send a message just thanking them for what they've done for today? Because we know the NHS is faced with so many pressures. So this is what it taught me about being compassionate, being aware as a practitioner when I qualify to the next stage of my career. So this is what clinical supervision really taught me. For me, it was really being aware that not every situation, control your emotions sometimes. You know, you can be triggered into making a reaction. For example, one of the main important ones, as somebody from the BM background, is when someone says your surname wrong, is it right for you to walk away from placement? Is that a right thing to a right reaction? Is there any way you can communicate your message if things are not going well on placement? So for me, that's why I started learning on how to move and how to behave myself when I'm on placement and raise those issues. So upon completing the Resilience Clinical Supervision course, in terms of how it transformed my life, I ended up becoming a member for, NMC Standards Development Group. I was invited to take part in that, listening to see how future standards are going to be transformed. I'm now also a member for NHS Digital Professional Team. I went to the Student Times Awards, and just really trying to encourage students to be really aware, just develop that self-confidence. It's not always somebody's fault per se, but sometimes what role are you playing in terms of how, how you're conducting yourself when you're on placement. So I just want to end. I wrote something very important. Just give me 1 second. I want to talk about resilience. So this is from Oprah Winfrey. She said, where there's no struggle, there's no strength. So raising your resilience threshold is a work in progress. So make sure you evaluate your action, keep a positive attitude, accept feedback when you get it from your practice assessors, take a break, and sometimes just let it go and move on to the next stage. It's not personal. Okay, so thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Grace and Lincoln. I knew you would bring to life the topic so brilliantly and really help everybody in the audience to understand that real true meaning and impact that clinical supervision can have. And many of the comments and questions that are coming through are saying absolutely this is important for students, but we support that this is important for the rest of our careers as registrants, and it's how we embed it as students to then have it as part of our identity. I would imagine, Lincoln, you will never practice as a nurse without access to clinical supervision going forward. So thank you both. That was a really great example of the how and the why. So we'll move on now to our next presenter, and thank you all for your questions. They're coming in thick and fast, and we'll get to those at the end, which is wonderful. But our next presenter is Louisa Long. One of the pieces of feedback we often get through our consultation work is, okay, we understand that this is important and we agree with you that this should happen, but how do we approach this? How do we have a model that is sustainable and embedded and that we can manage within our resources? So I'm really thrilled that Louisa's been able to join us today, because Louisa's approach to clinical supervision was actually shortlisted in the Student Nursing Times Awards last year. So this is a very much of a high quality approach that was really acknowledged by the Nursing Times as gold standard. So over to you, Louisa.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Gemma, and thank you everybody else. It's been really interesting to listen to how you've been describing your experiences of clinical supervision, and hopefully I'll segue nicely on from that and kind of link back to your experiences, particularly Lincoln, I think. So I've got some slides that I want to share, so bear with me. I'm not the most technical. Am I sharing that okay? Yeah, thank you. So yeah, I'm Louisa. I'm currently Assistant Professor of Mental Health Nursing at the University of Nottingham. And I thought I'd start by just kind of setting the scene with my story for my involvement with clinical supervision. So I came to nursing as a mature student, and probably one of the most nervous nursing students that you could imagine. I have lived experience of mental health problems, so I never sort of believed it was something I'd be able to do. And through my training, I found that the clinical supervision I received was absolutely the most critical and important part of my nurse training. I don't believe I could have completed my training without having received that support to build my confidence, and help me, see that my perspective and my growth and development over the course. So I'm quite a passionate advocate for it. So first of all, I received resilience-based clinical supervision, so I've been on that receiving end. And so when I graduated, I then wanted to go on to kind of pass that on and share that experience with others. So I trained as an RBCS facilitator. I did a 3-day course, and then I began delivering it to students at the University of Nottingham who were on the course that I just graduated from. So it was really nice because I was only that one step on from where they were. So, it was very fresh in my mind what they were experiencing at the time. And I found that really valuable. And I was also then delivering it in my clinical setting. So I moved on to then delivering masterclasses, as Grace was saying she did. So for different NHS trusts, so out in Lincolnshire, for staff from Nottinghamshire trusts and Derbyshire trusts, and then for other staff within the university. And not long after, I became a lecturer at the University of Nottingham. So that was 3 weeks before the first lockdown in the pandemic. So I had 3 lovely weeks in school, and then all of a sudden we were online. And I found myself tasked with developing clinical supervision for the virtual environment. And it's that sort of process of how we embedded it that I'm going to kind of explore here as just one example of how this can be done. And as Gemma mentioned, this sort of model that I put together was then, with my colleague Ella, was then shortlisted for the Student Nursing Times Awards. And we didn't win, but we had a wonderful day at the awards ceremony. So first of all, the first thing was working out what the challenges were for sustaining clinical supervision now that the pandemic had hit. We identified that the challenges were the value of clinical supervision being recognised, particularly for students who were joining during the pandemic who had no prior experience of what it meant. Promoting clinical supervision, making sure we got the word out to try and get as many people as possible to the sessions. We had a big issue with working with students' confidence to speak in virtual spaces, well, indeed, staff confidence as well. It was such a change. So it was finding, we were finding that people would have their cameras off and they were reticent to put comments in the chat and to put their microphones on. So getting people to engage in the sessions even when they were there was a bit of a challenge. And then people were sort of dropping in and out, appearing halfway through. So there was a challenge around the sort of sustaining the attendance consistently. So the approach we developed was to take that core resilience-based clinical supervision model and to preserve that as best we could within the virtual environment. So we thought we really need to focus on how we can make this virtual safe space, because it's very different to doing that face-to-face. So how are we going to make it feel safe? We wondered about how we could adapt the grounding activities so that they would work with everybody joining from their own sort of location. And we decided to try and support people to engage more. We would create some bite-sized skills sessions, which were much more structured activities that we could bring in if we were feeling that we weren't, people had kind of finished contributing and we weren't managing to get that flow going. So we could move that on a bit further. So there were 7 sessions that we created. I've given 3 examples here. One was the listening lab. So this was, we would send people out into separate sessions. I can't think of the term for it. I've gone blank, but we'd send them out in pairs into other sessions and they would spend 15 minutes listening to each other kind of uninterrupted. to explore the value of being listened to, how that feels, and being able to share kind of without interruptions, and also to practice and explore how to listen without, you know, with minimal sort of input from yourself, so it's very attuned. So that was one of them. Another example is we had a problem solving activity, which was the 6 hats exercise, if anyone's familiar with that, where you would assign a coloured hat to 6 members of the group, and each coloured hat represented a different way of problem solving and a different perspective. And it had the effect of making people feel less vulnerable because it wasn't their own perspective they were exploring, and it allowed them to step into a different way of looking at a problem and then kind of discuss it between themselves until they found what was the best fit. And the final one was, or that I'm going to mention, is a confidence session, which was very much around helping people to recognise their strengths. And we would create strengths portraits, and we'd try and encourage people to share what they felt confident with, what had gone well, just to kind of capture the things that were going well. So, and there was a few more as well, but they were probably my favourite ones to deliver. So the key challenge we identified was, how are we going to replicate that group intimacy that we have face to face? And we realised that consistency was absolutely key. So that was around establishing ground rules about the expectations, when people would join the sessions, not coming halfway through. We wanted to allow people to be vulnerable. We realised that might take a little bit longer in a virtual world than it would in a face-to-face session. We offered training for facilitators and also supervision for facilitators as we went along, so we could kind of pick up any things that were going on that we needed to focus on. And there was also very much an organic kind of co-production element to what we were doing. So the group members would suggest additions that they would like in order to support their kind of their pastoral well-being. So the suggestions that we had were they'd like a virtual wobble room they could go to at some points and just drop into. They started an online craft club, and another group even instigated a group Sunday lunch, a regular Sunday lunch. So they would all meet and just have that kind of social time in a safe space. And that came back to the group when we then met again, because they'd kind of forged that more relaxed relationship with being online. So I've included some feedback from our evaluations as I go along, so you'll notice some comments. And what we had feedback that the format was enjoyed, and that as time went on, people were being able to open up more and be more vulnerable. Another important sort of positive that came out of it was retention. And from our evaluations, the ways that it was supporting retention was where there was group consistency and group commitment. Students were more likely to keep going. Momentum was really important, so regularity, and that was really about how often the supervision was offered. We realised feeling like they belonged to the group, and I think Grace mentioned that before, was so important. And also creating psychological safety. So what are the boundaries within this virtual space? And as you can see, the comments around that were that students were feeling very nervous, particularly given the context of the pandemic. So it was really nice to have somewhere where they could just drop in, and they were, you know, in a friendly, safe environment where they could speak their mind. It was particularly distressing time for many students, and many were thinking about not continuing on the course, but actually they got the reassurance from their group support. Then another thing that came out of it was developing professional identities. As you can see from the comments, we had students saying that it helped them to see how they would be a supervisor and enable them to lead and supervise others better going forward. And they hadn't anticipated, I mean, it was good to see. We had another student who said they anticipated it was going to be an important aspect of their course. That was really good to see, but they didn't anticipate how helpful they would find it. So having field-specific groups and field-specific peer support kind of help develop a community of practice. And what we found is that from some of the students that have recently graduated, they've kept up that community of practice, and they've created their WhatsApp or their social media kind of support groups, and they've continued to replicate this after leaving as well, which is really nice to hear. So I can't see the title of this slide, I do apologise. Oh yes, okay, so the next aspect was around being able to build the skill of critical reflection. And again, you can see that we had students that recognised that it helped them to gain perspective and to have that validation of that their views of clinical situations and their judgments were good, even when they perhaps didn't agree with what they were seeing in practice. And it seemed like the core components that were helping this development of critical reflection were having access to critical friends, being validated in how they were feeling and what they were experiencing, becoming aware of their own cognitive distortions and having that knowledge of themselves, and importantly measuring their progress, so being able to notice where they were when they started and where they finished at the end of the year, and having that consistency with the same facilitator was really helpful in that process. So restrictions ended, and we were kind of offered a very creative opportunity to, having had all this new experience of working in a virtual way, to kind of see, well, where do we go forward from here? And I think this is very much where many people will be in this hybrid world that we're now living in. Students have valued having the online delivery because they haven't had the expense of traveling. It's convenient, doesn't matter where they're based, they can dip in. So there's some room for experimentation with hybridization. I mean, we're certainly still trying things out. We've had, we've had people joining online and being in the room, and we're still experimenting with that, I'd say. Bi-weekly sessions were certainly better attended. We've discovered that the bite-sized skill sessions work well face-to-face as well as virtually. So there's some experimentation to do with that. We've realised that it's consistency and being able to measure progress is absolutely key to how we embed it, and also the importance of constant promotion and growing the identity and awareness of the value of clinical supervision has to be an ongoing part of what we do. So finally, how are we going to do it? What's the future? So currently we're working on an outcome measure. So we started this off with a group of students that are currently going through this year, so we actually have that numerical measurement. We've created something like an outcome star, so they'll be able to see the volume of how much they've progressed in certain areas. So that's something that we're working on. We're looking at hybrid options and possibly thinking about how social media might be able to be used to create a space that people can dip in and out of. And we're thinking about how we can promote it and keep raising the profile within the university. So that's thank you everyone very much for listening, and that's my presentation. I shall stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Louisa. I mean, what an amazing example of innovation. And we said at the beginning, there's not one model or one approach to clinical supervision. We have to think about the preferences of the people that we're reaching out to, but also the resources and the potential barriers. And what you've shown us, Louisa, is that's completely possible. So really excellent. And just thinking about your presentation, Grace and Lincoln, it's starting to feel like that sense of connectivity is just so central, isn't it, to the value that students find from clinical supervision. And it's starting to feel like we're reframing this idea of seeking support and reaching out for help as an act of courage, and not one that represents the failure of our students. So that's just really wonderful and such an important message. So our final presenter on our panel today is Professor Paula Holt, who is our Senior Nursing Advisor from the Nursing Midwifery Council. There's Paula popping up now. So as the other presenters have already alluded to, the NMC have been so supportive of our efforts at the FNF to try and really push the importance of clinical supervision, and went so far as to write a letter of support. And I'm going to hand over to Paula now to tell us really what the NMC's position is on this and how they can help us to drive the agenda forward.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Stacey. It's really, really good to see everybody again, particularly the students who came to our professional standards advisory group and actually were so impactful in getting the message across about the importance of clinical supervision and indeed the value of clinical supervision to be used as practice hours, which I know was something that was not very clear until we had that good sit-down meeting. So thank you for that. So yeah, my name's Paula and I'm a senior nursing advisor at the Nursing and Midwifery Council, but I'm fairly new to the NMC. I've spent 18 years in clinical practice, primarily in mental health nursing, and then almost 20 years in higher education from lecturer through to Pro-Vice Chancellor. Importantly, I think I was regulation lead at the Council of Deans for 6 years, and that was really helpful, representing 90 universities that educate nurses, midwives and allied health professionals, because that gave me that real understanding of what the UK looks like, because we've already talked about the devolved nations and how sometimes they're a bit different. But I think the thing I enjoyed most about that role was how collegiate universities are in the health space. They might be in sort of competition in some areas, but actually in the health sphere, we do all collaborate. And I think this is a great example with clinical supervision of that. So thank you so much for inviting me. I'm very passionate about this myself, because before I consider the role of the NMC, I just want to say that for me personally, clinical supervision has been absolutely essential to me as a mental health nurse. It's supported by clinical decision making. It allowed me to reflect on the care that I was giving and has been critical actually to my own psychological well-being. Like many mental health nurses, I've been involved in caring for people in traumatic and isolated areas. So for example, I was in Bosnia during the war in 93, 94 and 97. And if it wasn't for clinical supervision, which I was getting over a telephone, a sat telephone in those days, I don't know how I would have managed to have the right clinical decision making in place. I mean, I'm blessed to have worked across a lot of roles within the NHS, the criminal justice system and the armed forces. And in all of those areas, interestingly, I have always seen strong clinical supervision in practice, but I do know that's not the same in all fields of nursing and midwifery. And I think there's something about the models we've heard about today, the model that Louisa has presented in terms of education and how we publicise, how we get more publications out there that say what some of the really good ways of accommodating clinical supervision within curricula are, and Louisa's was a great presentation for that. So one of the experiences I had with my higher education hat on in our support of clinical supervision was our mental health cohorts. We always had our second year students doing clinical supervision for the first years, third year students doing clinical supervision for the second years, and personal academic tutors doing clinical supervision for the third years. And that worked really well, not just in teaching the importance and learning the importance of clinical supervision, but it allowed our academic team to role model what good clinical supervision looked like. But it also gave us the experience, particularly when we saw students clinically supervising each other, of how many shapes and sizes and different ways you can do clinical supervision, from the very formal to the very informal. But the efficacy of that was still there and the value was still seen. So I'm sure that you're all aware of us as the NMC and what we do, and obviously we regulate 745,000 nurses, midwives and nursing associates across the United Kingdom, and we have nurses, midwives and nursing associates at over 90 approved education institutions. The vast majority of those universities, there is one FE college which has now been approved to deliver nursing associate, so we will see more providers coming along. So if you think about the vision of the NMC, it's about safe, effective and kind nursing and midwifery that improves everyone's health and well-being. there is emphasis on that because all of us are living at the moment with reports coming out that are talking about care that isn't as people that we care for would expect it. So this is all relevant to clinical supervision, because if we don't reflect on what we do, how do we make it better? How do we make sure that our practice is kind and safe and effective? So the NMC vision is obviously enshrined within the code, and everybody should be very aware of the code. And we live by that. It's something that all professionals who are registrants will adhere to. And it's something that students will aspire to. And our NMC values, the things that underpin what we do, are about us ourselves being fair and kind and ambitious and collaborative. And I think our PSAG, our Professional Standards Advisory Group, is a good example of that collaboration, bringing students in, bringing service users and carers that we care for into the room so that we know what all stakeholders think about what we do. So obviously, as well as regulating all of the educational programmes for nurses, midwives and nursing associates across the United Kingdom, we also maintain the register of professionals from that initial registration through to revalidation, of course. And we investigate concerns about nurses, midwives and nursing associates through fitness to practice. It's sad that fitness to practice is what a lot of people know the NMC for, which is not great. I'm going to lose my pin and all that sort of thing. That's not what it's about. And it's very important to stress that the NMC is very committed now to giving professionals the chance to address concerns and only taking action when absolutely needed. That is relevant in the clinical supervision sphere, because reflecting on practice, good clinical supervision is what is going to help people to address concerns, to address the way they care or their behaviour. So that part of what the NMC is working with is as important as the standards. So in terms of the standards for education that we produce, the standards framework for nursing, midwifery and education, those have particular standards that refer to clinical supervision, and those are the ones that were highlighted in the letter that we sent out to all of the universities. And it was important to send that letter out to remind every programme, and obviously Louisa has really taken this to heart, of the importance of clinical supervision. It's a really important part of the curriculum, and we're glad we sent that letter out. We've had good response from it. But if we look at the standards framework for nursing, midwifery and education, and you want to see where clinical supervision comes in, it's specifically, this is really quite nerdy, I apologise, it's 3.16, which says that all approved education institutions, together with their practice learning partners, must ensure that all students have opportunities throughout their programme to collaborate, learn with and from other professionals, and to learn with and from peers and develop supervision and leadership skills. If we unpick that, that is a really important standard. The collaboration and the interprofessional working is key. And it's great that clinical supervision models do involve professionals from different professions, and we highly encourage that. Every serious case review that's been published has had some issue about communication or lack of understanding of what that different professions do. So models of clinical supervision that include different professions, that are willing to explore the interface between different roles, are really, really important. So that's just one from the standards framework. If we look at the standards of proficiency for registered nurses, there is a standard under domain 5, which is 5.10, that says at the point of registration, the nurse will be able to contribute to supervision and team reflection activities to promote improvements in practice and service. And that is at the heart of what we do. We reflect so that we can improve, our practice, we can improve the care that we are delivering to those people that we care for. And that's why we do it. We don't ever finish our educational programme, whatever that might be, and think that's it, we've done. Learning continues, it's continuous throughout the entire journey of our career. And that standard is saying that we need to be able to team reflect and always promote improvements. One of the things that I was always taught and I obviously did my training a long, long time ago, was reflection is good because If you do something wrong and you reflect on it, you can think of 6, 7, 8, 9 different ways of doing it. So reflecting on things that don't go right is really, really important. You can reflect on something you've done really well, but you might just reflect that was the right thing to do. Doing things differently to try and improve practice is what brings out all that innovation. So the same standard for midwifery is 5.9 under that domain. So the standards do illustrate that support for supervision as a recognised part of clinical practice, and that's why we sent the letter out, because clinical practice does need to be cognizant of that. And we would expect practice learning partners to have that capacity and capability to provide that. And that's where it gets difficult, because we do have some areas of practice where having time, having capacity, having the willingness to engage is sometimes challenging. And I'm sure that some of the students that are listening today will know that that is a challenge in practice. Some of people who are being supervised in practice, students being supervised in practice, may be lucky if they get time with their supervisor to sit and go through their OAR. Still, getting time to do clinical supervision is sometimes very, very challenging, but it is something that's embedded in the standards and it's embedded in the code. So the NMC will always appraise the degree to which that clinical supervision is being enabled within a curriculum when they do their approval visit or any subsequent reporting or monitoring visits that they may have. So the NMC have made it clear that they recognise the importance of clinical supervision. They have encouraged AIs to support that with partners and to give opportunities for that in practice learning environments, and that might be in simulation, or it might be in theory lessons, or it might be out in practice. But what we want to ensure is that our students graduate and register with the right skills, the right knowledge and the capability to not only join our register, but work effectively in those multi-professional environments in future. So I hope that just gives a bit of an insight into how the NMC views clinical supervision. And as a regulator, yes, it's in the standards, but all of our standards are outcome focused. So we don't regulate exactly where, when and how it should take place. We rely on our education institutions to be innovative and creative in how they meet those outcomes, and that includes clinical supervision. So I'll stop now because I'm very conscious we need time for questions, but thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Paula. I think what you've shown us there, that where people might have put clinical supervision in the nice to have box, you've said actually it's front and centre. This is about safe practice. It's about retention, but it's also about high quality care. So we need to take this really seriously, and we can all play a part in doing that. So thank you so much for your messages. They're really important. So we've got time for a couple of questions. We will answer all of the questions, even if we have to do that offline. But there's one that came through first of all, and I think really key, and I'd wonder if Lincoln, I could ask you to answer this question. And it's come from Jess, and Jess has asked, what can current students do to push for clinical supervision within their course?
Wow, that's a very good question. For me, I think become a champion. I think I'm representing clinical supervision wherever I am. I'm always trying to encourage my students, my peers on various platforms, whether be it in the BME groups, be the advocate for clinical supervision, and scream and shout to the rooftop, to your lecturers, we need clinical supervision. And that's what I'm doing. And that's my recommendation.
Thank you. Anything you want to add there, Jess?
I think it's key what Lincoln said about championing, but also finding those allies within, I guess, the academic staff or the practice partners staff as well, because I think it's so much easier when you've got other people coming along with you. You don't have to battle it on your own, and then just sharing as much. I'm a massive advocate for social media, so obviously don't share the content of the clinical supervision sessions, but just share, the impact and what a difference it's made to you, and then more people will want to get involved too.
Fantastic, thank you, Jess. And we have a great question that's really close to my heart and the agenda at FNF from Fiona about how we can ensure that there is protected time for nurses and midwives to attend clinical supervision as registrants as well as students. Paula, I wonder if you've got any thoughts around that issue of time, because that is always the sticking point, isn't it, for us?
I think it is, and I think Louisa's session was really helpful in this. It's got to be built into the curriculum. It's a bit like building in personal academic tutoring time into the timetable, so that we do make sure that we progress our students and that they don't ever get left behind. It really is about that curriculum development. And if I would lobby, and I think, you know, what we've just heard there from Lincoln is really important. You can lobby your program team and say, we want to have protected time for this. In clinical practice, it's more difficult because of the pressures that we have got in clinical practice, but it is definitely one to feedback. The things that students need to, I'm sure they already know, is that their feedback is taken very seriously, whether it's to the National Student Survey, whether it's on their placement feedback forms, or whether it's on their module feedback or end of year feedback forms. Put that feedback down if you don't feel that you've had enough or you feel that you should be doing more, because student feedback gets listened to. I know as an academic that my student voice was much louder than the academic voice. So students, use your voice. I'm right behind Lincoln there.
Brilliant, thank you, Paula. And in terms of our registered staff, I think the work that we're doing through the clinical supervision subject expert group is to really demonstrate that the value, the added value of clinical supervision is far beyond that impact of it not being provided. And there are lots of different ways that we can measure that. Some of these hard measures around retention and quality of care, and linking that to areas where clinical supervision is embedded, makes that connection really clearly. So we are certainly supporting that case and really appreciate the question, Fiona. And then the last few questions are really about training for facilitators, those of us in the audience that have got this commitment to wanting to embed clinical supervision but haven't necessarily had the access to the preparation. First of all, Grace, would you have any advice for those that are interested in becoming facilitators?
Yeah, I think look for opportunities to do any kind of, I suppose, learning about clinical supervision. There's lots and lots of resources online. I was just actually thinking of Scotland are always brilliant at resources, and they've got a lovely resource on clinical supervision, which goes through different aspects of it. And I know the FNF website is going to be holding some resources. We also have on our website at FONS, we've got a course companion for resilience-based clinical supervision, which it goes through the different aspects of it and ways you can kind of work with others to, I suppose, practice facilitating and then go on to become a facilitator. We do also run programs, and if anyone's interested in having one of those programs, please do get in touch. All our information is on our website. And also looking at your, I suppose, your organisation's policies, and if there's any kind of training involved within the organisation. I've certainly done some e-learning for clinical supervision before.
Thank you, Grace.
Yeah, asking about and then looking around.
Absolutely. So there is often local provision for training, but as Grace said, we've had a real push around demystifying the skills of the clinical supervisor, because over the years it has moved into the domain of the clinical psychologists, and some nurses don't believe that they have the capability to facilitate clinical supervision, and we really want to challenge that position, because absolutely it is aligned with the nursing midwifery skill set, and through embedding it into the pre-registration curriculum, we really hope we'll have a whole generation of newly registered nurses and midwives who absolutely see not only the receiving of clinical supervision, but also the facilitating of clinical supervision as key to their role. I've been told by Jess that there's a question in the chat, I've missed it myself, about clinical supervision being mandatory. And just as our final question, I just wanted to ask Louisa what your thoughts are as somebody who has both received clinical supervision and delivered it. What do you think about the thoughts around it being mandatory?
I think it's positive as a voluntary thing, because you're going to bring your kind of commitment to it with it being voluntary, and I think that's important. But I think it needs to be promoted and valued, and the case put forward for why it's worth getting involved in, rather than mandatory, I think, so that everybody's there to get the most out of it, I suspect.
Thank you. Thanks, Louisa. And I'd agree with that point. And what we see as mandatory is that the protected time is in place for people to access the form of clinical supervision that they choose is most effective. Well, that's brought us to the end of our hour, and what a fantastic hour it's been. Thank you so much for the level of engagement in conversation, in the chat, in the questions, the wonderful presentations from our panel, which has just really brought this topic to life. I know I'll speak on behalf of Florence Nightingale Foundation and Jess as our chair of our clinical supervision seg to say, until we get to a point where every nurse and midwife has regular access to good quality clinical supervision, this agenda will stay really high up there on our priority list. So for those of you that are interested in getting more involved with the work that the FNF are taking forward in this area to help us to build that evidence base, to really showcase the wonderful examples of best practice that are happening all across the UK, please do reach out to us and keep this conversation going. Thank you all and have a great evening.
Thanks, bye.
Bye everyone.